The storm outside showed no sign of easing. Rain lashed against the windows with such persistence that the world beyond seemed blurred, softened into nothing but shadows and silver streaks. Inside, though, the café glowed warmly, the air scented with tea leaves and faint vanilla, a small island of comfort in the wildness of the night. Amelia sat with her cup cradled in both hands, but she barely tasted it. Her awareness was fixed on the man across from her, on the curve of his mouth as he smiled, the warmth in his eyes, the way his presence seemed to make the café walls shrink until they were breathing the same air, caught in the same current. She should have looked away. She should have finished her tea, thanked him politely, and left. That was what sense dictated. But sense had little power here. "What's your name?" he asked suddenly, his voice soft but threaded with intent. "Amelia," she said, after a small pause. "Amelia," he repeated, as though tasting the syllables. "Beautiful name." "And you?" she asked, her own voice low. "Ethan." He leaned forward, elbows on the table, hands wrapped loosely around his cup. "Tell me, Amelia, do you always drink your tea alone?" She raised an eyebrow, amused despite herself. "I could ask you the same." His smile deepened. "Touché." Silence stretched then, not empty but alive. The café around them faded, clinking cups, hushed chatter, the rustle of pages from someone reading in the corner. All of it blurred until the only sound Amelia truly heard was the storm and the steady thrum of her own heart. "May I?" Ethan asked suddenly, and before she could respond, he reached across the table. His fingers brushed lightly against hers, not a full touch, just the faintest stroke. Yet it was enough to send warmth spilling through her, as though the heat of his hand traveled straight into her veins. Her breath caught. "You're bold," she murmured. "Not bold," he said softly, his gaze fixed on hers. "Just certain." The rain beat harder. Amelia's pulse echoed it, fast, insistent. She should have pulled back, but instead, she turned her hand just enough so their palms pressed together. His skin was warm, slightly rough, grounding and electrifying all at once. The world seemed to narrow then. The café wasn't just a place anymore. It was a stage, and the storm outside was the curtain. Everything inside this moment belonged only to them. "Strangers sharing tea on a rainy night," Amelia whispered, half to herself. "Sounds like the beginning of a story." Ethan's lips curved. Or the beginning of something better. She couldn't look away from him. His eyes were steady, searching, as though he were memorizing every detail of her face. And she let him. For the first time in a long while, she let someone look closely. The server passed by, refilling cups, but Amelia barely noticed. All that mattered was the warmth of Ethan's hand, the intensity in his gaze, and the unspoken promise filling the air between them. "You don't seem afraid," he said softly. "Of what?" "Of this." He tilted his head slightly, their joined hands resting in the quiet space between them. Amelia swallowed. "Maybe I am. But fear doesn't always mean stop." That earned her a low chuckle, one that seemed to curl through her like smoke. His thumb brushed over her hand then, a slow, deliberate stroke, and she felt it everywhere, in her pulse, in her breath, in the heat that rose to her cheeks. The storm raged louder, rattling the glass, but inside, Amelia was drowning in a different kind of storm. And she didn't want to escape. The café's clock ticked quietly in the background, but Amelia hardly noticed. Time felt suspended, caught between the storm outside and the heat of Ethan's hand over hers. For once, she wasn't planning what came next, wasn't calculating how this should end. She was simply there, wrapped in the closeness of a stranger who somehow didn't feel like one. Ethan leaned back slightly, though his hand didn't leave hers. "So, Amelia," he said, his voice warm and deliberate, "what keeps you here on nights like this? Something tells me it isn't just the tea." She smiled faintly, looking down into her cup. "Maybe I like the quiet. Maybe I like watching the world go by from behind glass. It's safer here." "Safer," he echoed, as though tasting the word. "But safe isn't always living." Her eyes flicked up to meet his, and his gaze held her, unwavering. He said it lightly, but there was something beneath his words, something that pressed gently against the edges of her defenses. "And you?" she asked, needing to shift the focus. "Why do you come here?" He tilted his head, considering. At first, the tea. But tonight, his lips curved, slow and knowing. Tonight, it feels like the tea isn't the reason anymore. Her heart gave a small, startled leap. She didn't want to encourage him, at least, that's what she told herself. And yet, the warmth rising inside her betrayed the truth. "You don't even know me," she whispered. "Not yet," he said simply. "But I'd like to." Silence followed, and in it, the storm's fury outside seemed to swell. The cafe lights cast soft shadows across his face, highlighting the strong line of his jaw, the slight curl at the edge of his lips. Amelia found herself staring longer than she meant to, her chest tightening with the weight of unspoken thoughts. Finally, she pulled her hand back gently, fingers slipping from his. His brows lifted slightly, but he didn't protest. Instead, he studied her, as though he could read every flicker of hesitation on her face. "I should go," she said, though her voice lacked conviction. Ethan leaned forward again, closing the distance she'd tried to create. "Then let me walk you out. The storm's too wild to face alone." Her instinct told her to refuse, to draw lines, to retreat back into the safety of routine. But something else, something restless and alive, made her pause. "All right," she said softly. When they stood, the air between them felt charged, heavier than before. Amelia slipped on her coat, and Ethan held the door open for her. The storm rushed in instantly, fierce and cold, whipping at their hair and clothes. But even as rain pelted her cheeks and the wind tugged at her coat, Amelia felt oddly shielded by his presence at her side. They hurried beneath the awning, but the downpour was relentless. Water splashed around their shoes, and the street lamps blurred through the curtain of rain. "You live far?" he asked, his voice raised slightly over the storm. "Not too far. Just past the square." He nodded. "Then let me walk you." They stepped into the rain together. Within seconds, they were soaked, but Amelia found herself laughing, a soft, surprised sound that slipped out before she could stop it. Ethan glanced at her, his own smile tugging wider. "You're laughing," he said, as though it delighted him. "I don't usually," she admitted, brushing wet hair from her face. "Then I'll take that as a win." The square was nearly empty, the storm having driven most people inside. The cobblestones glistened, reflecting the glow of street lamps in shimmering pools. Amelia felt the cold seeping through her clothes, but the heat radiating from Ethan's nearness made it bearable. When they reached the fountain at the center of the square, they stopped beneath a tree whose branches offered little shelter. The storm roared around them, wild and alive. Amelia turned toward him, strands of wet hair clinging to her cheeks. Ethan stepped closer, close enough that she could see the raindrops sliding down his skin. "I can't decide," he said quietly, "whether this storm is trying to push us apart, or bring us closer." Her breath caught. The world seemed to blur around him, the rain, the square, the night itself, all fading until only his voice, his gaze, remained. "Maybe both," she whispered. He lifted a hand then, slow, deliberate, brushing a strand of hair from her face. His touch lingered, fingers trailing down the side of her cheek. The warmth of it cut through the storm, through everything. For a moment, neither of them moved. The air between them pulsed with possibility, with the dangerous sweetness of what might come next. And though Amelia's heart pounded with both fear and longing, she didn't step back.